Well, as Faith mentioned, I'm Rachel Glavich, and I work for Every Woman's Place in Webster House here in Muskegon. I have worked there probably about 12 years now. I started in our Webster House side, which is our teen side, and moved to the domestic violence and sexual assault side probably 10 years or so ago. And I've did a little bit of work with foster care there. We do a foster care program, so did some supervision for that. And then my primary job is the director of our domestic violence and sexual assault services. I used to be a therapist for domestic violence and sexual assault survivors, and now I do this. So we're going to they covered a lot on trauma and how that impacts your relationship with your baby and pregnancy. So we're going to kind of cover that a little bit again. But again, remember, I work with the domestic violence survivors. That's pretty much my sole job. And then we refer to the medical people when we need that, and we're very appreciative. So here I go. And feel free to just interrupt if you have questions. So we're first going to cover domestic violence in general and what we know about it. So we know that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 5 teen girls experience physical and or sexual violence, and we know it's very underreported as well. So what the actual numbers are probably even higher, but this is the estimate we have. The definition of domestic violence, when you guys think of domestic violence, what do you think of? Do you have a definition that you would think of?
Abusive relationship.
Abusive relationships, perfect. And when you think of, we have a broader definition than law enforcement. Law enforcement, basically, you need some evidence, somebody has to hit somebody else, basically. We obviously have a much broader definition, and we look at emotional abuse, isolation, threats, intimidation, that type of thing, keeping you away from your family, your friends, moving you away. Them are all things that we consider domestic violence. Even the verbal stuff, in all my time with women, every client I've ever worked with that has had physical and verbal abuse, all of them will tell me that the verbal abuse has a much deeper impact than the physical abuse. Clearly, the physical abuse is highly lethal at times, and so can be extremely dangerous. The emotional abuse is also extremely dangerous because of the impact it has on women and the children. We'll get to what services we offer later. However, I do want to cover, I will refer to women quite a bit as the survivors. The majority of the people that we work with and the majority of victims of domestic violence are women. We certainly serve men. I am very well aware that there's men survivors out there and victims. However, the primary work we do and the primary victimization is to women. So we'll refer to that more often. So we look at a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior perpetrated by an individual towards another individual. That is how we define domestic violence. When you are, all incidences of violence aren't always domestic violence. It's got to be a pattern of power and control. So this is the wheel that we use all of the time. I feel like there should be, okay, I was going to say, I thought there was more. A little new to the slide and things popping up. But so if you go anywhere, pretty much you're going to see a wheel such as this if you go to talk to somebody about domestic violence. So there's kind of different ones. This one has a lot to do with people coming from other countries, but the sections would be the same. So we look at emotional abuse, economic abuse, sexual abuse, using children against somebody, threats, using citizenship or residency privilege, intimidation and isolation. So all of those things are kind of like the spokes on the wheel that lead to the violence. And generally, if the verbal violence doesn't work, they will continue to escalate. Assailant will escalate. So if originally a look worked to intimidate somebody, and so it's a very intimidating look, it definitely has a meaning behind it. If that stops working, they may go to throwing something or slamming something, or they will, if that stops working, they'll go to physical violence a lot of times. So, and most of the time there's both, going on still. So again, it's not just physical or sexual violence that constitutes domestic violence. And again, if you call the police for the other things, the legal definition is just different than public health's is. So now I gotta say first with this question, why do women stay in domestic violence relationships? We at our agency and the domestic violence movement would much more prefer that people ask, why does he do that? However, everywhere I go, I get, why does she stay? Does anyone have any thoughts of why somebody would stay?
You know, I was listening to something on NPR the other day, and this woman was talking about being in a domestic violence relationship and being married, and something I'd never thought of before was when she stated she didn't look at herself as a victim, she saw herself as the one person who could save him or change him. You know, if I can just stay and love him enough, or, you know, that I can, so she felt maybe that was her way of taking power or having that ownership of the situation. I don't know, but I never thought of it that way before, and that struck me. So
Yeah, it's a lot of hope. You know, they have hope. And I think from my work and my experience, our survivors they look very similar and feel very similar as I would. They love their person for the most part. Sometimes that fades away and they don't anymore, but they love them. If my husband's hurting, I want to help him. So do they. And abusive people are pretty manipulative, so they also can play that up. You know, if she goes to leave, well, I'm never gonna make it without you. And people don't think of that as domestic violence because a lot of it mimics healthy relationships. If the guy says, you know, I don't know what I would do without you, that is something you might say in a healthy relationship. Man, I can't imagine life without you. Generally, abusive people mean that very differently. Like they are leading to, I'm going to kill myself if you leave. And that sounds like, to some people, if they're a victim's talking to somebody, I don't think you recognize that always as control. It very much keeps somebody there. The last thing I want is, if I'm going to divorce my husband, is for him to kill himself. That's very scary. And you certainly, if you have children, you don't want your children to think you're the reason their dad killed himself. And they use these things. So yeah, there's lots of reasons. So there's hope, and you also hope that you will have, most people will tell you there's lots of good days too in a domestic violence relationship. So they have hope that they can have more of those good days. Fear, if he's told you he will kill you or kill your children if you leave, and he already told you that about the dog, he was going to kill the dog and your dog ends up dead, that threat becomes extremely real. And so it's easy for friends and family and workers and places to say, he's just threatening you. He's just threatening you. You don't have to listen to that. Oftentimes they will carry it out. There are a lot of empty threats and they're not going to do it. But in those times he's then acted on that becomes very real. So there's obviously lots of reasons. Any more reasons people are thinking why people would stay? Financial. So these are just some. Obviously there's lots. But yes, money. And people say, well, money's not a reason to stay in a bad relationship. If any of you have children and you cannot feed them, you cannot keep heat on for them, first of all, you're going to have protective services called. So you don't want that. You want to keep your babies with you. And second of all, it feels really bad. It feels really, really bad when you can't care for your children. And a lot of times abusive people have made it very convenient to get you in that situation. So honey, you don't need to work. You just stay home and take care of our kids. That seems very sweet. Yeah, but it's not. They're doing it so they don't have a way to get out. They're isolated. They're without resources. So if you don't have a car, a job, or a house, how frightening if you try to leave. Also, thinking of with their children, there is a good chance he's going to get the children half the time at least. That doesn't work where the mom just gets the kids, and well, there's been a history of domestic violence, so he's not going to get them. Especially in Muskegon County, that does not happen. He is very likely to get your children half of the time. So if you're thinking, I'm terrified to be with him, a lot of women don't want to leave their children with them half the time if they're not there. So that seems like, yeah, but they would be better if they were just still with you, but he's going to have them. and he's probably going to abuse somebody else in front of your children as well.